Thank you very much for coming. As a preliminary explanation, we've been running an exhibit program at SCI-Arc, as many of you know, for about 4 years. And almost every exhibition was the occasion for a fairly raucous debate and an exchange of ideas in the hallways, in the studios, and so on. And we decided that henceforward, and we started with Wiscombe and the ubiquitous dragonfly. Some of you remember it was an interesting discussion in the middle of the summer. So the pro forma now is that after each exhibition is up for a while, we'll have a discussion like this. It'll involve myself or a surrogate, the designers, and you, to the extent that you want to participate, critique, comment. So this ought to be as informal as possible. And if there are in the spirit of SCI-Arc egalitarianism, if you want to talk, comment, there'll be plenty of time to do that. You may remember the last time we did this with Tom, who didn't show up, I guess. It's once was enough, maybe?
No, they are on field trip.
Field trip. The old field trip. But his project was called Dragonfly. And that labeling, nomenclature, occasioned a fairly long discussion, because once you name it, label it, call it something, and many of you know this in studio and review discussions, you do one project, you describe a different project, and then you listen to the jury actually discourse about something which is probably in the end not what your intention may have been. So there's a general, I think, discussion which is worthwhile having that has to do with how projects are labeled and talked about, as long as we assume that in the discussion of architecture, in the teaching of architecture, in the learning of architecture, that a discussion of projects is fruitful, promising, constructive, productive, useful, and all of that. I remember a number of years ago having a thesis student who put her work on a wall, and you've all heard this story in one form or another, put her work up on the wall and walked away and said, "That's it. Do whatever you want with it." So I think one of the reasons I raise that is because we're obviously involved regularly in discussing work, and at the same time, whatever it is that is so often compelling about design and design ideas is not always capturable or articulatable in these kinds of discussions. So there's language and discussion and all of that, and we all try to operate in that format. And I think we also know the limits of that. I think both are important. But the label means something, because Ming and Craig could have decided to untitle it or title it something else. So consistent with the last discussion, correct me if I'm wrong, it's Kē-ärō skŭÅr'ō, is that right?
Yeah, it's Kē-ärō skŭÅr'ō.
That's right. And this I know from some distant art history class, but Kē-ärō skŭÅr'ō, as far as I know, is a modeling technique in 2 dimensions that suggests 3 dimensions. It's early, correct me if I get it wrong, and I promise you I didn't look it up, and I have no idea where to look it up, but it's an early Italian Renaissance label. I don't know if it's their label or a critic's label that was brought to it later by painters like Masaccio, who began to represent figures in a certain way. So the general question to Craig and Ming would have to do, is this 2 dimensions suggesting 3 dimensions? Why are we talking about a label, or why are we using a label which belongs to the 14th century and has to do with Italian Renaissance painting? And is that productive in terms of what we see around us?
Well, actually, we have a discussion, Craig and I, with whether we should be calling this Kē-ärō skŭår'ō or should we be calling this an anamorphic perspective, which also date back to the whatever 14th, 15th, 16th century, which has to do with the deformation of the of a perspective in a quadrangle, the way you describe and the way you represent a space with the 2 walls, the 3 walls, and the 4 walls.
I mean, I guess...
I don't know whether we should call it Kē-ärō skŭår'ō because Eric was calling it zippertone, which is may not be dating back from the 16th century or the 14th century, but it does date back to the 1960s, which I think it's all about a certain way of representing an image. And Kē-ärō skŭår'ō is not about a 2-dimensional becoming a 3-dimensional as much as it is also about the effect of darkness and lightness.
The actual origin is when they started making, you've all seen kind of gray charcoal paper, and then paintings, particularly pencil drawings from that era, when they began using white chalk on the gray paper. That was a kind of breakthrough to start drawing with light, because they were drawing both with highlights and with shadows. And so when we started thinking about this whole exhibit, we thought, well, physicality was something that we were kind of trying to avoid. And what we wanted to deal with, as Ming and Eric have both been saying, is the kind of 2-dimensional effect, so that it's really a graphic effect of light and dark that we're trying to achieve. And so in a way it's kind of painting with light. And so technically that's what we were trying to do. And then Ming, you should talk more about the way the distortion of the space works.
Well, I was more interested in having an illusion with the way you created it.
Let me follow up on that. Just out of curiosity, people who know the term in the room, Kē-ärō skŭår'ō, who know the term, who recognize the term, predating this discussion. Because you knew that? Inaba knew that. But because the question is, if the label is useful, if the label is productive, does the label or the language have to be shared? One of the interesting discussions about design and architecture and city making now has to do with whether there's a common language or a common series of ideas to which people can refer, so that the discussion is to some extent shared. And if you label a project in a way that people don't know and don't recognize, is that your problem or their problem, or is it not a problem at all?
Well, I'm always interested in multiple meanings. So even if somebody understands what Kē-ärō skŭår'ō means, it doesn't necessarily mean that they would interpret it in that way. I mean, I don't think that we are interested in the effect of light and shadow, or the effect of turning something which is from 2-dimensional into 3-dimensional. That's one way of reading it. Or whether we are looking at something which is a distorted perspective. All of those can happen either individually or simultaneously. So the idea that one would get the title of the exhibit doesn't really matter from that point of view.
Yeah, but Eric's saying something interesting also, because if you're talking about a kind of elitist sort of thing, or twist, maybe if it doesn't communicate, that's very interesting, because it didn't seem like Kē-ärō skŭår'ō, it didn't seem like an exotic word, which is why we turned the volume up with the Webster's thing to make it a little more exotic. So it's very interesting. And then when the translation of it into the, what is it called, the Webster's type thing, and the little umlauts over the A's began making this wonderful graphic, then we started thinking, oh, this is really cool. Now maybe we should just slice some of it apart and make it just a graphic.
So it's really about what it looks like.
A little bit, and a lot of Japanese cars are named for the way the letters look.
Because it suggests something which is Asian, which is eminently European. The way it's written is Asian in the dictionaries. One other thing, there are probably a number of architects and students in the room who are quite interested in how architecture moves forward, what techniques it uses, and to try to ride the edge of something that takes them or you to the future. And in that context, the question is, a reference to an idea which looks backward in a certain way, is that in the context of a discussion that also looks forward, a productive kind of exchange? In other words, it's this and it's this, or it has to only be this.
It's never about one thing, right?
Could be.
It could be.
I mean, you didn't have to call it that. I mean, you could have called it something from the Apollo space program.
Yeah, but
Kē-ärō skŭår'ō just happened to be a term, right? Which just happened to be a term about technique, or happened to be a term about a certain effect, and it's not, even though it started centuries ago, it is still nevertheless, I think, still valid in terms of how, for example, I mean, Craig and I have been talking about this Gans
effect.
Gans effect, which has a lot to do with how light bounces around, and how light bounces around depending on the thickness of a materials, and how the reflectivity of that happens, and how you start losing the light. And that is something which is more scientific, as opposed to something which has to rely on a kind of painting technique.
Well, but the thing is that they're like, our eyes and our bodies are always sort of the same, right? I mean, our perceptions don't change, but the technology that you use to sort of get something into your eyeballs is always changing. And so this piece of white chalk in the 16th century was a cool thing, and people started exploiting it. And you then, Eric, I think when you said the Zipatone deal, do you guys all know what Zipatone is? Probably not a soul. Anybody?
Zipatone.
Hernan, you know what Zipatone, somebody does. Okay.
Okay, well, we don't have
really
to
amazing,
force it.
because that's just as esoteric. Zipatone was a film pre-printed with patterns that when you were doing graphics or architecture, you would stick onto the paper drawing and cut the shape with a knife. So when you go into Photoshop and you see that little knife as an icon, it's actually an icon that's referring to the old process of cutting Zipatone, which was very labor intensive. And then Ming, you've got that funny Greek word for that,
Another one.
skŭår'ō.
Let me
Anyway,
shift
I'm sorry, that was a diversion.
The gears a little bit. You were talking about the effect of light, and I think you said shadow. And there, in the thesis reviews, there were a number of instances where, in one form or another, a discussion arose having to do with what I would call means and ends. And the means conceivably have to do with technical tools or representational techniques, modeling capabilities, and so on. As ends in themselves, meaning the model is what it is, the software is what it is, the drawing is what it is, and in many cases the representational techniques and as means seem to have become ends in lieu of other conceptual, cultural, sociological, poetic objectives. And so I think this is an important question in design. It always is an important question in design. The tools that you use to make what you make, and to what extent the tools then become the objective as opposed to the facilitator. And the question is here, in this case, is what we're looking at a certain kind of light or a certain kind of physical technique or technical apparatus, and is that what the project is about? In other words, if you stand close to the wall, for instance, you see the light, you understand the light, form of the light, light of the light, which we'll probably get to in terms of its tone and its color. Is this about lighting as a technical exercise, or does it have another motive, a poetic motive, a cultural motive, a space motive, a shape motive? What's driving it, and what are its intentions?
Well, the intentions are a little bit Brechtian, like you just said, in that you're both aware of the illusion and of the technique that gets it there. So we weren't at all concerned in a negative way that you would see behind the curtain, as it were. You know, that you see the apparatus which produces the illusion. And, you know, it's a kind of Marxist, Brechtian kind of idea that you don't shelter the reality from the observer. You break down the proscenium arch. The actors walk off the stage into the auditorium. So in this case, you can look behind it and understand the operation. So there was, Eric, that aspect of wanting to execute the technical part in a way which would withstand scrutiny.
Meaning you make something and the exhibition describes or allows you to understand how it was made.
Exactly.
Because you could have made it and hidden the light.
Exactly.
Could have been done that way.
That's right.
Yes.
There's still proscenium openings. Right. There's still curtains. Everything's not the three-penny opera.
Exactly.
So this is the choice.
Yeah,
and it's a choice for the audience.
It was absolutely a choice that you would see it. And in fact, we because we were interested in intellectual issues like propagation and the modulation of the light and so forth, we were a bit surprised, I think, to find that the pattern created behind the curtain is perhaps even more intriguing than the pattern in front of the curtain.
Did you know what was coming?
Not really. It's
No.
incredibly hard to figure
very
out
difficult
what this
to-
kind of thing is going to do.
Prototype this.
So to some extent, you were prepared to accept the result that you didn't anticipate, which is also, at least in concept, an interesting proposition, because it has to do with to what extent you're interested in controlling what's coming at the end, and to what extent you're prepared to let come out of the discourse what comes out of the discourse as a consequence of putting certain things together. Is that?
Well, yes, I think that in order to control everything, you have to be able to predict certain phenomena, and in this particular case, and then just speaking for SCI-Arc in particular, I think that what I am very interested in is experiment with certain phenomena and experiment with the way we would be putting this together, and that the physicality of how this is installed would create a certain kind of experience. And I'm not interested in success or failure as much as interested in how, if we, for example, place the disc 10 inches away from the wall, the effect would be very different from if it was to be placed 6 inches from the wall. And it really has more to do with kind of a barometer of how do we move things back and forth and how do we assemble things. So it's not about having a predetermined solution to the problem.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I mean, those of you that know our work in other contexts probably are aware of the fact that we don't really subscribe to the idea of burying structure within a cosmetic exterior. We don't really subscribe to the idea that the building is somehow divorced from its making. We usually try to get the making of the structure right out there on the surface. So there's a thoroughness to the process, which in some ways is similar to this, in that, you know, we took a lot of pains when we were, you know, beginning to order this environment, with even doing like a time and motion study of how many minutes would be required for each sub-assembly, and how many man-hours were required to roll all those through. Part of that is just because we're fascinated with the poetics and the sort of intrinsic beauty of a process that's very orderly.
Let me ask you something else. I think Ming said that this was an experiment, which raises a question that has to be asked here, and I guess in other places, the presumption that anything which can call itself experimental is ipso facto a virtue. And whether you're a subscriber to that, it's an experiment, it's good, it conserves, it's not so good. And the second piece of that is, if it's experimental, can you tell us how it's experimental? What's the experiment?
Ming can answer that.
First of all, it is an experiment if you've never done anything like this before.
So it's an experiment, meaning an experiment for you.
Yes.
Wouldn't have to be an experiment for the world.
No.
So the two categories.
It's two very different things.
Which is at least interesting, I have to say, for students, meaning if somebody knows it and has done it, and you don't know it, and if knowing it has to do with doing it, then it may be that you have to rerun for your own work or your own understanding something which somebody else may claim they know and can do. So the question of experiment may have to do with it's an experiment in the world's never seen it, but it also has a personal reading, which I think has to do with you and your understanding in your own work, which probably means you have to go through it. It reminds me, a number of years ago, I think when Sherry Gelden was still around in LA, and Koshalik made an exhibition of Isosake's work, and somehow he couldn't show up, and I got stuck taking people around, and as the docent of the evening. And I remember the project was the Gunma Museum, which is a series of blocks, a series of cubes, which nobody at this point in time, and certainly in this venue, would consider to be an unusual area of investigation. And I remember trying to explain it. It was a project he did very early in his career, but that what was potentially interesting about it was that it was his investigation, and in order to master this subject, and I think this pertains to students for sure, and maybe faculty too, to master it, just a series of cubes and one turned. and that was it, toward the entrance to the project. They built it. So I guess the conclusion, or my conclusion, would be experiment isn't self-explanatory. You hear a lot of that around SCI-Arc and in other places when radical architecture or progressive architecture, unusual architecture is talked about. But I think it also has something very particularly to do with a personal life and a personal investigation. If you wanted to define your own life as experimental, you have to learn in some ways or relearn what it's conceivable other people already know. And I think in an educational way, it may be fair to say this is an experiment, and a legitimate one. Otherwise, you're putting students and faculty, for that matter, architects in general for that matter, in a position where if you didn't produce what nobody had ever seen, you failed. And this may be a position, actually, and maybe it's a discussable position. It's hard to deliver that position in a school.
Well, there's an empirical dimension to experimentation that that has, to some degree, been short-circuited by, Maya and Rhino, et cetera, and that empirical thing, which both scientific method and the artistic method both use. It's cut and try, see what works. And when Ming was talking about how far from the wall do we position this, we worked that out with a prototype that we built and analyzed that. And we could indeed make some choice empirically about what was going to happen. We then tried to model it in Maya. And it was a complete failure because the very subtle interactions of these low light levels with one another are way beyond the capacity of the ray tracing programs to deal with. And so if one of the things that we were very literally unsure about until we turned on the light was what would be the character of the modulation of the since the light source is constant, sometimes it's on a very small element, and sometimes it's behind very large elements.
Let me ask you something about the light.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of discussions here and elsewhere about structure. And structure is related to an organizational order, conceptual strategy, which may or may not be legible, but at the level that it's often addressed here, it refers to what keeps the roof from falling in. So structure in terms of columns and beams in an old-fashioned sense is one definition of structure or one area for discussion. And the question is whether something like light could be a conceptual, organizational, ordering mechanism for a project. Mm-hmm. It's not what keeps the roof from falling down, but it's what orders the space. Is light the structure, or is it an ellipse? What's the structure of the project? I mean, is that a discussable subject?
Well, it's interesting that you talk about structure, because one of the, I think one of the biggest challenge for us has a lot to do with how to hold this ellipse on the wall, purely structural, and how much cantilevering can we afford so that the legs behind it will not be too big and too dominant. So there is a balance between support, whether it's a column supporting the roof or whether it's a support supporting just this plane. If we talk about structuring the space, it's less to have. I mean, I don't think that it has more. It has anything. I don't think that that we were looking at light as structuring the space as much as how the whole combination of the patterning, the modulation of the light, change the environment that you are within, and change the perception of for example, of a known space, which is a gallery that we all know, as well as changing the kind of a physicality of the space.
Does the light fixture hold the panel off the wall? Is the light physically supporting the panel?
No.
No, you mean the fixture or the radiation?
Well, the ellipse, which I think we'll probably get to, is not up against the wall. Something's holding it cantilevered from the surface of the wall.
Yes, that's what Ming was talking about.
And that's not the, is that the fixture itself?
No.
Or that's an additional apparatus?
No, that is a structure. That is a leg. We call it a pod. It's like a tripod pod.
Let me see if I can get at it another. Given the wherewithal, does three walls compromise the conceptual consequence? Why not the floor?
Sure.
Why not the ceiling?
Yes.
And why not the rear wall? And if nothing else, if you're prepared to blank out that, why don't we blank out the lid? I mean, how do you read the organization of the space if it belongs to three sides? I mean, is that a mistake, or is it, how do you account for that?
Good question. Maybe you have to, no, because this is where you come directly toward structure and budget and resources. And actually the original plan was to build a ceiling over this space. But combined with the necessity to create a kind of liminal quality to that meant the structure for the ceiling would have to be extremely
Wait. If you can't do that, because I have to say, if we had a project, the budget's $50 million.
Right.
If it would have been 75, we would have nailed it.
Right.
So assuming that line of argument is not the line of argument I'm looking for, if you can't do it everywhere, then why not? I think Marta Molly did this. He took a piece of a wall and just said, okay, I'm interested in this. Check it out. And not made an attempt to describe a room or not. The question is, would it have been better in that case to do a piece of it or to try to describe the whole room?
What do you think?
What do I think?
Yeah.
I would have gone for the whole room. Like you have to. There are issues of the wall. There are issues of going around corners.
Yeah.
And you're going around a corner in elevation, and you're going around a corner three-dimensionally, and then nobody can come in the room because it's the floor.
Well, you would walk between these things.
Well,
yes, but that would be a different proposition altogether, because one way of looking at it would be to have an all-surround kind of spatial experience, where you would have the wall, the floor, the ceiling, everything would be one wrapper. But I don't. On the other hand, the other way of looking at this is to be looking at like three surfaces. I mean, even when we were looking at the ceiling, we were only looking at three planes: the wall, ceiling, and the other wall, as opposed to wall, wall, wall. So I was much more interested in kind of leaving something out of that, which is a very, very different way of perceiving, because because I know what you're talking about, but the idea that when you perceive something and you always have a double reading, as opposed to just a single reading.
I think what I'm chasing after has to do with the power of the idea and how you deliver the idea. And when we were talking about Masaccio and we were talking about three-dimensional modeling in the 14th century, whether this actually, as an effect, belongs to a wall and a surface and a plane, or whether the idea is to make a volume, which is the container, and then something lifted off the surface of the container, like a double surface. And my guess is that the force of that idea is it leaks out the black stuff, and it leaks out the roof, or the structure, and it becomes a very different proposition as three surfaces than it would as a container, and you can't escape it. It's above you, below you, around you. You're done.
That is.
And and the question is, if the idea, it has to do with the idea and the delivery of an idea, which very much belongs to our discussions here forever. And if the idea has purpose as a surface, should it have been delivered as a volume? And it seems to try to be a volume, but it didn't quite make a volume, or else the implication is enough.
What I was saying before about Brecht and politics, and about sort of what this was all about, it was really not for an audience per se. It wasn't to be a piece that was all wrapped up and complete. It was, I mean, in that sense, it's an experiment that you're absolutely right, that if it were to be a permanent installation or something that where we knew what we were doing, as opposed to a device where we were going to learn from,
right,
then we would have wanted to package it, put a bow around it, and present it as a piece.
Right. I'm not saying it has to be done, and I think the purpose of the gallery here is clearly different than in other venues, because I think it's certainly perfectly acceptable. Indeed, I think it's encouraged that people would do for SCI-Arc and for the SCI-Arc community, for the students and for the faculty and so on, what they don't know how to do. I think this is the idea. Having done that, the question is, what did you learn? What is it? How do you know? What should it have been? And would this have a completely different meaning if it were over you, if it were
Sure.
inexorable, meaning you can't escape it? And I think I have a sense that it would have a very different kind of force.
Well, I mean, I think that having this wrap around above your head, that's not a problem. I'm actually much more interested in the next experiment, which would have to do with what would this be on the floor where you were to be walking around it, because how can you create this effect if you're able to?
Well, that would have been a different, some of you know that the exhibition that Tom did in the Pompidou, and what was, I think, fascinating about it and teed off those who understand museums in a somewhat more sacrosanct way is you walked on it. So there's glass stuff and the models were under the glass, and in order to see the exhibition you had to take off your shoes and walk over the glass and see the models underneath. And it would have been, I mean, this would be another discussion if this had only been the floor. You couldn't come in the room, or you come in the room, you got to negotiate all this stuff, or you can only see it from up on top, or you just let in one person at a time. You have to get in line or something. You don't want to wait in line, too bad. Because I think the possibility, the floor would have been in a way completely unique, because then, and I think that's what Maine did, whether you like the exhibit or not, what was so interesting about it was the conception of the exhibit as a surface you walk on. Nobody does that, right? make an exhibition and walk on it so you can't see it. And it was a way of forcing people to look and to understand in a way that going to museums don't typically encourage. You put it on the wall, right? It's kind of normal. Here it is on the wall. It's kind of normal. Mm-hmm. And it's just a question, and it's of course how much.
Which is again, I think he was doing that because he was interested in changing your perception. He wanted to change the way you look at the work, and you look at it on the floor below you, and it also changed the whole meaning of the work itself. And I think that it probably is much less precious if you look at it from that point of view. So he's interested in people having a different idea when they are trying to understand his work.
And there's also, actually, if you followed a certain kind of logic, which would be different than the logic we were trying to follow here.
Right.
The aerial, the plan view of Tom's work in particular, and the roofscape in particular, is one of the more attractive and creative aspects of the work. So giving you a helicopter ride over the work is in a way a very logical extension of the.
Right. I don't want to pick on him.
No, I'm not picking on him. I'm just saying, because here it would be different. And I'll tell you, on the floor, unfortunately, you would be limited to the elevation of your eyes above the floor. So certain of the perceptual things that happen would never happen unless they're perpendicular or somehow you're able to align yourself normally to the surface. Because one of the things we learned here, all of these.
Well, you would get the shadow of the people walking on the floor. I mean, either walking in between the lily pads.
That'd be nice.
And it would be very, very different. Because you are always, but when you're walking on the floor, you are constantly aware that you're walking on the floor.
And in between objects. So it amplifies the object nature of it.
Well, it also engages the pedestrian.
Well, that's right. I mean, it could be
because
fun.
You got to negotiate this goddamn thing.
But for instance, we were, up until the time we turned on the lights, literally, we were planning to paint these surfaces black. Up until the moment that we turned on the lights. Is Kathy out there anywhere?
She's on field trip.
Oh, she's on a field trip. Yeah. At any rate, one of the unknowns was incalculable, for instance.
Right.
And if we turned off those lights, you guys would see, it was literally incalculable to know how much that light was going to dilute the surface and light the adjacent or the opposite wall.
I think what I'm after, and I think particularly for this audience, is that it's not only the technique and what it is that we're looking at and how it's made and the exhibition of technique as an end in itself, but it has everything to do with where it is in the space. I mean, again, hypothetically, one could have done a piece on a wall or a piece in a corner, or a piece in a corner which is corner lid, or wrapped it around or something like that. And it would, given the same technique, in very different positions, very different consequences, which is
it's very true.
Yeah, and I think would be worthy of the consideration of what is largely a student audience. Anybody want to comment? Yeah. What?
I think it has to do with the way the LED came.
There are anomalies in the LED light spectrum. I think it comes from the manufacturing process. And it's pretty much randomized throughout the whole installation. And we noticed it, of course, right away. And it also put to rest one of the other incalculable things about this. And that was that we had also speculated about painting the backs of these ellipses different colors in order to reflect those lights back on the wall and get a richer interaction of light. And once again, the subtleties you're talking about only became evident when we actually had the whole room up. And so we were very pleased with the cool and warm quality, but it was an anomaly.
You know, what's interesting about the question and your answer raises another question which has come up recently in the post-thesis evaluation of the thesis work, and it has to do with the role of expert and expertise, and narrowly defined, meaning the person who pours concrete understands how to make concrete, not necessarily the architect or the planner, or the person who appreciates this most is the person who understands the light, low voltage lighting, and the technique. So that if you really want to know the truth of this, you have to, this is a question, not an answer, but it's a hypothesis that you hear a lot. So you have to really show it to somebody who is an expert on the technology. And I give you another example. And I have to attribute this to Florencia, who made the remark. If I said to Florencia, here's a thesis project and it has such and such CNC milling and 3D print and something. And how do I read the capacity of the student? How do I know the student understands? What does the student understand, and so on? And I think at least part of the answer was you understand what the student understands if you understand what the student did. Meaning, in order to know whether the work is successful in this context, you need to understand the technique and the technology, meaning presumably you need to be a master of it. And I think, in my view, is this is utterly untrue, although there is a perspective that has to do with experts and expert knowledge, and that a lot of the criticism that needs to be brought to bear about architecture and city making belongs to the people who don't have a particular kind of expertise about how to make concrete, but have a very clear idea of the consequences of concrete in their world, in their space, or how it describes what they need to do in the operation of a building. So I think this is a discussion for us in general, and it's worth talking about, because my guess is somebody could explain to you in a very particular way how artful or how unartful was the application of this particular light, and wouldn't necessarily, as a consequence of that, be able to give us the meaning or the purpose or evaluate the effectiveness of that technique as a spatial idea at all. So technical expertise and technical capacity doesn't necessarily give you a perspective which allows you to evaluate. What does is a separate question. And I think to some extent the success of this or lack thereof is related, would you agree, maybe you wouldn't, to appreciating a particular kind of technology applied in a particular way. I mean, is it necessary? Does that help you to understand, or no?
Well, there was a really interesting progression about this design, because it actually came from the under-counter lighting fixtures that you find in hardware stores, and picking one up and wondering what could we do with this, because it was inexpensive and available and had some interesting technical qualities.
Which also has a populist
and very
aspect.
populist. That's
Yeah,
right.
very,
Off the
very,
shelf,
it's
available.
accessible.
Accessible.
Which is a different conceptual argument, meaning the artifact either is an artifact which wasn't designed for this purpose, or it's not a designy, shishi, I don't know, a Dwell magazine, I don't know what the right context would be, for a piece of art as light, but as something utterly different, if not banal, inexpensive, and is then applied in a different way. And what makes the art out of it is the application of it, and that it's cheap and therefore it belongs to everybody and in a way can be used by anybody. So it's not esoteric knowledge, it's actually pretty normal stuff. Get it in any hardware store, right?
That's exactly right.
And that's a value of yours, of
I
you
think
guys.
that's something
that's
that
what
we
we
bring
like to
and
do.
because, no, it's very true.
Yes, and also I think it has. We were also interested in finding ways of demonstrating a kind of a, you know, and going back to the technical aspect of it. I mean, we a lot of this process really went back to how do you put things together and the kind of energy consumption of how do you light this entire room. We were very interested in not having to change 180 batteries, right? Versus how do you do that? And it's really, it all also boils down to it's not an art form. It's really a problem solving.
I mean, just for right.
I don't think that we're interested in elevating it.
Right.
At least that's not what
But
I'm
for the sake of just a discussion, in that sense, if you were interested in the technique, why wouldn't you just do it once? In other words, what do you learn or what do you get by doing it multiple times? I mean, what would the exhibit mean if there were just one of those things on the wall in a technical way?
From a technical perspective, we learned what we needed to learn in our, you know, in our studio once.
Right.
And we saw that it had this potential. From the point of view of then layering it with other kinds of, you know, other kinds of either meaning or sensory kind of impact, when you start thinking about, for instance, if you look at it as a multiple, one item would make it very precious, a la Robert Irwin.
Right.
That's not our intention, to make something precious.
Right.
But then at the same time, if you do it once, you only are interested in the technique of lighting the effect of one thing, which is very different. It's different than trying to create a whole space with the repetition of a certain pattern.
Right. I had one more. Well, let me just end it with this, because in looking at it, trying to understand it, the question is whether if it picked you up and moved you up and down or back and forth or from that corner to that corner to that corner. In other words, is there anything which is directional about it? Is there anything which is kinetic about it? As opposed to something which is what it is and kind of stays there, whether the light would grow or the pieces would get closer and the pieces get further, this kind of thing. So it has something to do with a more animated sense of what your eye does or what your head does, which probably is also related to, tell me where to stand. Where should I stand? Or does it matter to you? Which is interesting. We say you can only come and stand right here, or you can go anywhere you want, which is the other side of not only what it is but where it is, but the corollary is from where you see it or look at it, understand it, all of that. Whether any of that was part of this discussion or conception.
Well, I think that when I was referring to anamorphic painting earlier, it has to do with how you perceive something depending on the position where you are, which has to do with whether it is something, depending on the position, it is either true, natural, normal, or whether it is distorted and deformed and forced as a perspective. So going back to a propagation of pattern and the way we were distorting the ellipse and stretching it would then give you different position in the room where you can perceive.
But the light mechanism, you do that by cutting out ellipses that are different sizes. But I mean, for instance, if the panel's tipped with respect to the wall, all the panels are parallel to the wall.
Yes.
If the panel started to do this and it started to do that, so the degree of distortion is a function of the departure from what is parallel to something else, and you could manipulate. It's another manipulation, but it might make it more directional, like hotter, 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 colder, 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 something like that. Which
it's interesting because I think most of the way that perhaps you're looking at it, and it's interesting because it's not the way we had looked at it at all. So it's interesting to think of it as more artifactual than sensory, let's say. And I think we were interested in it as a place-making device. Something, in other words, where this was a place which had a certain character as opposed to an object on the wall. And that the character of the place might have an emotional or psychological effect, more so than as as an object which you appreciate. So there's probably a little bit of a Buddhist sort of Zen kind of, rock garden kind of quality there.
Burma West.
But that, more than that, it's an artifact that you appreciate as an object.
Right.